Rector Magnificus, ladies and gentlemen, friends and families, honored and distinguished learned opponents. Welcome, good afternoon. As you see from the title of my thesis, I have been looking at climate change adaptation. But what exactly is climate change adaptation? Well, to put it in a nutshell, it is any actions, physical, non-physical, policy-wise, taken to deal with a changing climate. That can be, on the one hand, building a sea dike, for example, to prevent against storm surges or possible sea level rise. Or, if we're lucky, we might be able to enjoy high-quality, low-cost champagne that will come from the south of England. But the question really is, why is this important? Why is adaptation important? Well, as you probably are aware, the climate is changing, and even if we were to stop all greenhouse gases now, the climate would continue to change. And as a result, we will probably or inevitably suffer consequences, some of those dire. Already, what we've seen in the past 15 years or so in Europe are a series of high-profile heat waves. Also, we've had the issue of flooding. Just this year alone, Paris withstood one of the strongest floods it's seen since 1910. 2 years ago, also in England, in Germany, and other places in Europe. Floods that have cost millions and millions of euros and damaged people's lives and livelihoods. So, recognizing this, European governments, starting around the mid-2000s, started to say, hey, even though we need to mitigate, i.e. reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we also need to adapt. We need to deal with a changing climate. And in that vein, they did start reacting. In 2008, 9 EU member states had national adaptation policies to deal with climate change, so-called national adaptation policies. And by 2013, 15 did. By 2009, there were 31 regional adaptation strategies. Those are subnational strategies in 6 EU member states. And between 2005 and 2010, the number of recorded individual policy measures grew in the EU by some 635%. The EU itself, as an institution, also has been forcing or pushing the issue of adaptation on their member states. And to that end, they issued a green paper, a white paper, and in 2013, a strategy to help guide the member states undertake adaptation. Thereby, in 2014, every member state recorded some form of adaptation activity or policy. Now that leads me to the research questions, or my research questions for the thesis. First, is this rapid development of policies and institutions dealing with adaptation in the EU leading to the emergence of climate adaptation as a new, never-before-seen policy field? And I will describe what a policy field is in just a bit. If so, second question, how can we explain the emergence of new policy fields? How do they happen? Where do they come from? And in particular, how can adaptation be described as emerging into a new policy field? And then lastly, I look at what would a model of policy field development look like, an actual model. Now, how does this translate into my actual thesis? Well, in Chapter 2 builds a definition, constructs a definition of a policy field, and applies it to the case of England to see if it can be considered a policy field there. This was primarily taken through desk study. Chapter 3 creates an empirical scoring mechanism of that definition for a policy field and surveys through an online survey 27 or so EU member states to see where and if adaptation is emerging into a policy field across Europe. Now, switching gears, Chapter 4 then starts to consider how policy fields might come about and which factors might contribute to them. Again, using the same survey, I test to see which factors could be the most important for new policy field development, and based upon the results, I draw up a tentative hypothesis. And then in the final research chapter, I try to test that hypothesis in the case of England. So I take that and I interviewed adaptation experts in that to see if the hypothesis that was created, the tentative hypothesis, sort of matched, or not sort of, if it matched, and to what degree it matched the historical reality there in England. As a result of that, I then create the framework of how a policy field might emerge. Now, what is a policy field? To many of you, you might think this is very intuitive. You think of agricultural policy or environmental policy. It's an area of policy regarding one particular topic. But the interesting thing, when I started out this research, I found that in the policy science literature, and even in the political science literature, there was no definition. There were some tangential mentions of what it might be, but there was no actual academic definition of what a policy field is. Therefore, there was obviously no discussion on how it might come about. So I had to create a definition. And I say that a policy field is three parts. Three. First, authority. Authority over the subject that it's dealing with. So in this case, adaptation for my research. But the authority to make policy and actual policy over that topic. The next is order. Specifically, institutional order. There need to be institutions dealing with that topic that have the authority to make policy over that topic. Lastly, expertise. You need to have expertise. You need to have people who are interested in the topic, who are knowledgeable about the topic, and who have a willingness to make policy on the topic. And they can be within government and outside of government. Now, what are the results of where we found policy field emergence? Out of our survey sample, we found that, in fact, there was a range or a degree of policy field emergence, going from limited emergence all the way up to highly significant. And these comprise of 15 countries. Now, save for the UK, which scored the highest, which I took as my case both at the beginning and the end of the thesis, there's a pretty even distribution around the other countries as to the degree of the emergence that they're going through. So what this tells me is that the first question of my research question actually is validated. That maybe we can't say as a result of the growth in policy it's turning, but in a sense, it is turning into a policy field in a number of countries. So now, switching gears, looking at how a policy field comes about. Well, if you consider, as I mentioned, the policy sciences literature, which is what I'm primarily rooted in, the policy sciences literature did not have a definition of what a policy field was. Therefore, they also didn't even look at how they might come about. So that forced me to take one level up and start looking at political science theories of governing. So I decided to look at the three seminal theories in political science. That is pluralism, elitism, and new institutionalism, or institutionalism, if you will. So in this sense, you could say pluralism was the push for adaptation becoming a policy field, a groundswell populist movement where people were demanding and asking of government to take action on the issue. Or conversely, was the issue propelled forward by a small group of elite policymakers or elite policy community who, outside of the public view per se, were pushing and striving to make adaptation grow? Or lastly, we might think that it's a result of institutional change over time, that as new policy problems evolve, institutions are not coped to deal with them, so they change and evolve, and that thereby it might have been a policy field. Or are there elements of all three? What are my results? In this, I found for the entire sample of the 15 countries that showed policy field emergence, that it was the factor of elitism that scored the highest. However, all other factors were there. All other factors were there. So based upon that, and based upon the results of the survey, the tentative hypotheses I tested led me to the construction of what I call the elite driver framework for policy field emergence. Now, starting in the far left box at the top, what I say in a nutshell is essentially it is elite policy communities that push for new policies, that's the box in the middle, they push for new policies to be created over their subject. Once those new policies are created, we move to the box on the far right, those policies spur the creation of new institutions, new organizations to manage those policies. So first you have the experts who want new, or the elites who want new policy. They achieve new policy. That new policy creates new institutions. In the meantime, in terms of expertise, the new policies attract new forms of expertise because they put demands on people to react to the policy. And that's the arrow on the left side going down. But on the other hand, as well, you have experts, newly formed experts, people who take interest in the issue, People who are attracted towards the issue, so they're attracted towards the policy, so there's new experts that are attracted towards the new policies and or institutions. So, in a sense, that is my thesis, that is my research in a nutshell. Thank you very much.